Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this exciting virtual event. I'm Pamela Boone, Senior Managing Director of Client Service Solutions and Global Markets at State Street. Welcome to the third session in a year-long series of conversations about justice, equity, and inclusion, hosted by the Massachusetts and Texas Conferences for Women, State Street, and the Boston Globe. As with our past two sessions, today's conversation is for everyone, for people of color and our allies, for women and men, and our non-binary brothers and sisters. This session, The Cost of Racism, Cultivating Transparent Workplaces from the Inside, is incredibly timely and important. We will explore the self-destructive bargain of racism, the rising cost to us all, the ways we can unite to achieve transformative change within our workplaces so we can prosper together. At State Street, we understand the cost of racism and inequality. We recently launched our 10 Actions Against Racism and Inequality, which tackle issues of representation, diversity, and education for our company and the communities where we live and work. We believe we have the opportunity to be part of the solution, and we take that responsibility very seriously. We have begun to see progress with the action plans that we have launched. Two such examples include State Street recently announced the addition of two new board members, Julio Portolatin and John Ria, who both have extensive leadership experience and further diversifies our board of directors. In addition, State Street recently announced an $850 million public debt offering that closed in early March. The offering utilized an underwriting syndicate substantially made up of Black and Latinx-owned businesses, further demonstrating State Street's intentional commitment to diversity. I know that I speak for State Street and the Boston Globe in saying that we continue to be a proud partner with the Massachusetts and Texas Conferences for Women in hosting this important year-long speaker series. We are incredibly thrilled to share that we have record attendance for today's session. Your commitment and leadership is what we need to advance justice, equity, and inclusion within our organizations and teams. So today, we're happy to have with us Heather Mcgee, NBC News analyst and expert on racial healing. She is one of the most brilliant and influential thinkers exploring inequality today. And just last month, her eagerly anticipated book was released, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone, and How We Can Prosper Together. She will start today's session with remarks to explore the true costs of racism, not just for people of color, but for everyone. Following her remarks, Heather will lead a panel discussion to explore ways we can kickstart a much needed cultural effort towards putting systemic repair into action with urgency, sensitivity, and transparency. So today's panelists include Najuma Atkinson, the Senior Vice President of Global Human Resource Services in the CHRO at Dell. Javier Barrientos, the Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Takeda Pharmaceuticals, as well as China Widener, Consulting Business Leader at Deloitte. I am so excited to get started. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Heather Mcgee.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Pamela, for that kind introduction. And thank you to all the sponsors of the event for being here. I'm thrilled to be on this all-star panel of extraordinary leaders who have beaten the odds to enter into the highest levels of corporate leadership and have so much wisdom to share with all of us. And I'm particularly grateful that 1,500 people have zoomed in on this Thursday morning to talk about these issues, hopefully learn something, laugh a little, be moved, and leave into their workday with a little more sense of focus and purpose. It's wonderful that State Street and the Boston Globe are making this possible for all of us. So thank you to everyone. As Pamela said, I'm Heather Mcgee. For 20 years, I helped to build, and then for 4 years, I was the president of a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank, which focused on solutions to economic inequality in America. It's called DEMOS. It's the Greek word for the people, the root word of democracy. And in that role, I was focused on the economic data, all the economic indicators which were showing that it was getting harder and harder for working families to make ends meet. While our economy was still producing massive amounts of wealth, that wealth was being increasingly concentrated in the hands of folks who already had wealth and in the most profitable corporations, while small business starts and independent businesses were struggling. Before the pandemic, 40% of working adults were not paid enough to meet their basic needs. 40% of families with children struggled to meet their basic needs for their children. 1 out of 7 children in America was living under the poverty line, a poverty measure which itself is inadequate for all of the needs that a family has. And the richest 1% of the American income distribution owns as much wealth as the entire middle class. This to me is a sign of an economy that has fallen very far from the economy that the United States had in the middle of the 20th century, in which we created the highest standard of living the world had ever seen, the greatest middle class the world had ever seen. And we did it based on a formula of smart public investments, a social contract between business, labor, and government that agreed that it was in everyone's best interest for our people to have a decent life. That took the shape of public investments from the creation of the mortgage market and tight regulation of the mortgage market, massive subsidization in the creation of housing and suburban developments, big public investments in infrastructure, which used to be the envy of the world, high levels of labor protection, whether it was the minimum wage that was in inflation adjusted dollars nearly 3 times what it is today, and including strong levels of labor law enforcement so that collective bargaining rates were high to ensure that the middle class took home a consummate share of the value that they produced for corporate America. It was during this ethos of the sort of New Deal economic social contract that we saw the greatest expansion that the middle class had ever seen. And yet, including things like the GI Bill, which put hundreds of thousands of GIs into college education and made a professional class and a set of investments that redounded to our economic benefit, nearly $4 for every public dollar invested. But all of these public investments and protections that I just mentioned, from the New Deal labor protections to the mortgage market through to the GI Bill, were either by explicit design, such as in the mortgage market, where the federal government drew maps of the United States and drew red do not lend lines around Black neighborhoods, virtually all of them in the United States, or through to the GI Bill, which was race neutral on its face, but was filtered through a segregated and discriminatory labor and housing and segregated education market. Virtually all that I just described that created the formula for broadly shared economic prosperity was segregated for whites only. It's so important, and I do this in my book, The Sum of Us. I spend a couple of pages just listing all of the free stuff that the government gave to white Americans over the course of that period of time to ensure their economic prosperity and stability. It's so important to recognize that as the first step in understanding where we are today, how it is that we have an 8-to-1 white to Black wealth divide, which, as I say, is where history shows up in your wallet. So much of the current visible economic disparities across communities of color and white communities is attributable directly to this inequality, exclusion, and explicit racism in the way that the government invested in wealth building in America. A McKinsey study very recently calculated for us, which was very helpful, that the racial economic divide, and specifically the wealth gap that I just talked about, results in $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion in lost consumption and investment between 2019 and 2028. Citigroup calculated that even more broadly, not just the wealth divide, but all of the economic divides around education, investment, housing, wealth, and employment and income cost our economy $16 trillion over the last 20 years. And that if the racial gaps between Black and white families on these measures was closed today, we would see $5 trillion in additional GDP over the next 5 years. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco calculated that in just 1 year, 2019, the economic divide between white men and everybody else cost over $2 trillion. Now, this is pretty massive economic swing that we're talking about. This is a pretty massive economic swing that we're talking about. We are talking about trillions of dollars of lost potential to our economy. It's important for us to think about the case for racial equity, the case for making the kinds of investments and equity-based practices that recognize that we are not all starting from the same place. Because when our economic policies were more generous, were more supportive of the average family's economic well-being, those were mainly cordoned off to white families. As we began to see the opening up of our social policies and the civil rights movement to allow Black and Brown families to apply for jobs that they were heretofore excluded from, to go to schools that they were heretofore excluded from, to live in neighborhoods that we were heretofore excluded from, we also began to see a shift in the economic rules that basically withdrew virtually all of those supports that I just mentioned. In the books, The Sum of Us, I talk about the drained public pool as a metaphor for understanding not just the how we created the inequality era that I described at the outset, the era in which 1% of our population owns more wealth than the entire middle class and 40% of our families are struggling to make ends meet. That did not used to be the way we described the American economy. And yet inequality began to grow precipitously from the 1970s onward, really in the wake of the civil rights movement. It was almost as if Black and Brown families were let in to see the American dream, to really get a glimpse of it, and then policymakers began to turn the lights out on that dream. I talk about the drained public pool as a metaphor because one of the very small and yet quite present in people's lives symbols and examples of that kind of public social contract, the commitment by our government to a decent standard of living among all of our people, with that asterisk, was in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the grand resort style public swimming pool. Was something that is mostly gone from the American landscape today, but we used to have nearly 2,000 of them in this country. And when in the civil rights movement, Black families began to sue and win, saying, hey, those are our tax dollars too that built and maintained those pools. We want our kids to swim as well. Across the country, and not just in the Jim Crow segregated South, cities and towns decided to drain their public swimming pools rather than integrate them. Now, what that meant, of course, was that white children and white families lost out on a resource as well. It meant that what was once a public good, a meeting place for the community, became a private amenity. People began to build backyard swimming pools. In the Washington, D.C. area alone, in the wake of pool integration, 120 private membership-only swim clubs cropped up. What was once a public good became a private cost and a luxury amenity. I think about higher education as another example of that. We used to pay through federal dollars and state dollars for the cost of going to public college, back when over 95% of the college-going population was white. As part of this anti-government ethos, we began to cut back on what we were funding, what we were spending on public colleges. We shifted from grants to loans at the federal level, and now we have over $1.5 trillion in student loan debt. And the average public college graduate graduates with 5 figures in debt. Now, this is a clear example of a systemically racist system where 8 out of 10 Black families have to borrow, largely because of that racial wealth divide I was describing. And yet it also impacts 6 out of 10 white borrowers as well. In the end, for me, in the research that I conducted over 3 years to write The Sum of Us, What Racism Cost Everyone, and How We Can Prosper Together, I was able to find, nonetheless, these places across the country, these stories of what I began to call a solidarity dividend. And that's the idea that we can unlock gains that are common solutions to common problems, but only if we roll up our sleeves and link arms across lines of race. In the book, in the final chapter, I talk about a trip I took to Lewiston, Maine, where the city had become really one of those dying mill towns that we talk about so much, where we had begun to truly see the downtown Main Street vacant and boarded up as the jobs had gone overseas or to the American South. And yet the city has been revitalized by the presence of Black, Muslim, refugees, and immigrants. I talk about the story of white folks in Maine whose lives have been turned around by moving into solidarity and fellowship to help revitalize their community in partnership with these new Mainers. There are stories like that all over the country. And I also come to you today as someone who, like many of you, I'm sure, held the role as an executive in an institution. When I became president of my organization, Demos, I was the only person of color on the executive team. I was a 33-year-old young Black woman. The organization was 75% white. In many ways, we had believed the idea that if you're going to be a think tank, depending on high levels of education and statistical analysis, that it's natural that you will be a majority white organization. And yet I launched in the first months of my tenure at Demos a multi-year racial equity organizational transformation project. And the idea was that we could not actually fulfill our mission, which was to provide an equal say and an equal chance in our economy and our democracy for all, without addressing racial equity in our policymaking, recommendations, and in our research, but also in having the skills among all of our staff, white, Black, and everyone in between, to lead with competency and self-awareness on issues of race, to be able to speak to racial disparities and to be able to design race-conscious solutions with confidence and with grace, to be able to lead diverse teams and function in diverse coalitional spaces, talk to funders of different races, and have the kind of self-awareness and of your group identity and the power dynamics that attach to be able to be effective. In my book, I quote Catherine Phillips, who is unfortunately gone now, but she was the first tenured Black woman at the Columbia Business School, and she studied the impact of diversity on business and on group problem solving and innovation. And what she found was that groups that are more diverse come to one another with a heightened level of awareness and focus and anticipation of difference that can often create a little bit of friction. But she said it's that productive friction that creates the energy of diversity that leads to better problem solving, critical thinking, reasoning, and innovation. We've all read the studies that show that more diverse business enterprises have higher scores on innovation. I'm really reminded of something Catherine Phillips wrote. She wrote that in a statistical experiment where she paired groups that had high levels of diversity with all white groups. And she said the groups with racial diversity significantly outperformed the groups with no racial diversity. Being with similar others leads us to think we all hold the same information and share the same perspective. This perspective, which stopped the all-white groups from effectively processing the information that was given in the experiment, is what hinders creativity and innovation. Put simply, my friends, we have been afforded, out of many of the tragedies and oppressions of our shared history, the most diverse population of any of our peer competitive nations. That can be our superpower to allow us to regain our competitive advantage. And yet, for the past 50 years, we have had a draining of the public pool of resources. We have had policies that have rewarded those who are already wealthy and powerful. And we have not been able to, at the institutional and firm level, really maximize the benefits latent in having such diverse teams. When we have so many of our best players on the sidelines, of course, we're not going to be able to score as many points. When we're trapped in an us versus them zero-sum way of thinking about racial dynamics in our country and at our firms, we are not seeing what can be solidarity dividends, unlocking higher performance for all of us. Now, the three people we are going to bring into the conversation now are some of the brightest, shrewdest, and most enjoyable people to talk to about these issues. They are people who have led with that kind of grace and skill, multiracial and multi-ethnic teams, who have taught their own firms in different sectors how to unlock the superpower of diversity. I want to thank you all again for being a part of this conversation, for taking the time, for listening with an open heart and open mind, and providing a raft of questions that were already submitted online before this, that we're going to now bring the three members of the panels in to answer. And we're going to have a good conversation with some questions that I've prepared for about 15 minutes, and then bring in your questions that you've already submitted. So without further ado, I'd like to bring in Najima, China, and Javier. Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Hi, this is so great. I wish you were sort of walking in from off stage to a round of furious applause, but applause is something that, like shoes, as China said, has been lost in the Zoom era. So you all have heard the bios of these extraordinary people. I want to get right into it because it's really so important for us to hear from each of their perspectives. And we could obviously talk for another 90 minutes about all of this. I first want to pose my first question to Najima Atkinson from Dell. You have 20 years of experience leading global organizations and have really moved Dell to a place of high effectiveness along these issues. And so one of the questions I want to ask you is, what are the important performance practices to consider when promoting transformational change along lines of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the workplace?
Great. Thanks, Heather. It is a pleasure to be with you and the other panelists. I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you, State Street and Boston Globe, for hosting us. I do want to make one correction. I'm not the CHRO of Dell Technologies. I am a part of the CHRO. When we think about what we need to do to ensure we've got the right type of practices when it comes to performance management in an organization, there are a couple of things that I think about personally, and I would challenge others to think about. Is this an evolution or is it a revolution? So you really have to think about this from the perspective of how deeply do you need to assess your culture, its policies, and its practices, and the changes that you have to partake. For us, I'm very fortunate at Dell that we've been on this journey for quite some time. And so our position is more of an evolution than a revolution. We really value providing a culture and an environment where everyone can be inclusive and be their best selves. About 4 or 5 years ago, for instance, from a performance management perspective, we removed performance ratings. And performance ratings really ensured that, as everyone knows, that there was a distribution curve. And we found that when you looked at some assessments of that the quality of the discussion wasn't where we needed it to be. And so by removing a performance rating, we allowed leaders and team members to have a more intimate conversation. And so they really got to know each other on a different level other than looking at only statistics and metrics. The other thing we do is we really want to make sure that you know your talent throughout the entire organization. It is really important that we provide an environment that we assess our talent deeply in the organization so that we understand where those areas of opportunities are, specifically in areas where we have underrepresented minorities or people of color. We take a really deliberate approach to ensuring we've got full visibility to them. We ensure that for all of our team members, inclusive of our underrepresented minorities, we've got sponsors that are aligned to them, and we've got very deliberate talent practices and plans that help them advance on their own careers. So those are just a couple of things that I would recommend you do. You want to make sure that you've got the right level of conversations occurring at the senior leadership level, training them. You want to ensure that you've got the right visibility to your talent throughout, and you've got very specific, actionable, and measurable plans that leaders have to be accountable for moving that talent throughout.
Excellent, great, thank you. My next question is for China. China is at Deloitte, as we heard, the consulting business leader in the telecom, media, and technology industry market. 20 plus years of C-level leadership, really impressive background. So there's so many questions that I could ask you about your experience in this area, but let's take a broad one. Obviously, we know that 2020 brought much needed focus on racial inequities in our society and within the workplace. As a leader and as an organization, Deloitte, how have you all taken a stand and made a difference on the societal issues, as well as bringing those values into the workplace?
So first of all, thank you, Heather. So happy to be here this morning and have this conversation, because I think it's incredibly important for it to be an ongoing dialogue. There is not a one moment fix to the challenges that we've been talking about. When we talk about sort of the things we've done at Deloitte, there are a couple of things, but I want to couch it in the context of a framework, because I think that's super important as we all think about where we are in our respective journeys as entities and individuals. And so what I call energy action, this notion that there are really 3 E's that come into play, and that's really around evangelizing, educating, and empowering. And so when we think about it from the context of, you can be an anchor institution, or you can simply take up space on the block. And what Deloitte's decided to do and to be is really a bit of an anchor institution so that you get that external social impact, right, for the communities where we are and those that we serve. And the way that we've done that are a couple of ways. There's time, talent, and treasure. And the reality is our communities need all 3. And so what we've done is really taken that concept and said, what are the treasures we can provide? We've gone on and had a level of donation and capital matching at the rate of $5 million. For community use and empowerment of community entities and organizations. We've then gone on to say, what is the education effort that we actually need to employ? That can't just be an internal look. Everybody doesn't come through the doors of Deloitte. So with that regard, we've looked to support those organizations that perpetuate education along the spectrum of generations. So from youth and children, because ultimately what they learn then is what they actually, how they behave and what they utilize as adults, as well as organizations that are supporting and serving adults. And then from a business capacity, right, this notion of educating our own. The reality is we all come into this life with a different set of experiences, some of what we know and some of what we believe we know. And this notion around education really is how we then broaden allyship and actually bring allies to the table. There are people who want to be allies, but don't really necessarily know or appreciate. They don't necessarily have the historical context, Heather, that you talked about, or to understand those policies and practices that contribute to our current state. So that education notion, that idea of how do we actually build allyship. And so standing up a number of programs inside the firm that allow us to educate our own so that the message can be carried externally as we touch the clients that we serve, the communities where we serve, et cetera. And the last piece is around empowerment. And this is incredibly important because it really is about the ongoing nature of the action and the conversation. And so we've stood up what we call the Black Action Council, I serve on that council, an equity and representation subcommittee, and it's really designed to say, how do we A, identify, and B, then actuate change against those things that are systemic. They are systemic, but not necessarily, one can have a debate about whether anything was ever intentional or deliberate. In some instances, history tells us it was, and it's clear. In other instances, it becomes accepted history and shared practice, so it gets perpetuated. And the notion of the council is to say, let's understand where we have those processes or practices, and then let's eradicate them, and let's communicate that they're being eradicated. So in a way that allows accountability and transparency. And that really has been the way that we've approached this idea of both what do we do internally and how do we engage our communities.
Right. Thank you, China. I'm just going to ask one follow-up question. Is there a specific example that you think is illustrative of either an action that has been taken through the Black Action Council, or when you were talking about education, the second bucket, is there a specific type of education that you have funded and supported externally that you want to give as an example for the audience?
Sure. So the council, one of the things that became incredibly important is this concept that depending on where you are in this journey, it feels like it has been going on forever. We have been having a lot of the same conversation. And so it became incredibly important to have a series of down payments, things that were actions that were communicated to our population that said, change isn't coming, it's here. That we are in fact taking action that you can place a bet on, and we're going to give you some evidence of that action. So for instance, we just, as a result of a natural evolution of retirement and movement, just in the organization as a whole, we took a moment and said, let's take a pause and understand what decisions are we making relative to our next generation of leaders? And are we making sure that all of the potential candidates who have the capacity and the ability and the expertise, right, to hold roles, that we are being deliberate and really structured in how we think about that? Having done that, the good news is what we discovered is instead of asking why not or asking why a person was ready, we asked why not. And the result of that is a fundamental shift in who has a seat at the table and who's engaged in leadership roles. That is important. And I know that with the questions that came in, we're going to talk about representation and why it matters. And so I won't spoil that part of it. But the result of the council's action, right, to our leadership and with our leadership and in support of from our leadership has been to change the makeup going forward in a way that really tells our practitioners that here, there is something real. The opportunity, right, for you to grow and develop is ever present. And that was really important because the down payment concept, right, as opposed to the promise of a future, needed to be real time and real.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. I love that down payment concept. Javier, so the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Takeda Pharmaceuticals, formerly at T-Mobile, and having worked at a number of different very significant firms in our economy. Very exciting to talk to you about these issues. You bring an approach that you call leading from the inside out, building inside out DE&I strategies. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, thanks so much, Heather. And first, I want to acknowledge it's a pleasure to be here with you, Najima, and China. And I'm having a bit of that kind of an imposter syndrome voice at the back of my head and sharing this stage with you. And I say that to acknowledge that, even those of us who are in senior leadership positions, who come from underrepresented backgrounds, have these system embedded in us. We are also part of that system that we're trying to change. And so when we think about building inside out strategies, it's really to be able to achieve fundamental change, the kind of change that you talked about that reverses the draining of the pool. It requires to have more than good intentions in our organization. There's plenty of people who have great intentions. The important thing is to ground those intentions in solid reflection and analysis and diagnosing what is the problems that we're trying to solve. And then, really create a strategy that is focused on moving the needle and producing outcomes that really move the needle. And for that, as you would know very well, Heather, from your background, you need a good set of analytics and metrics that accompany your strategy. So that is, to use China's language, you have proof and evidence that the work that you're doing in D&I along the journey is actually having the intended impact that you want. And I also think, as you do this, you begin to actually achieve accomplishments that earn the trust of the very communities that you need to bring into the dialogue, that you need to use your language, Heather, to hold arms with, to solve these complex problems. And that trust leads to better business outcomes, better workplace outcomes, and the expanding of that business opportunities that lead to that solidarity dividend, right? Both from the point of view of your customers, your vendors and suppliers, your employees, the entire ecosystem, which companies can have when they see diversity, equity, and inclusion comprehensively, not just in the workforce, but in the entire ecosystem. They can have that very transformative effect that China described by being the anchor, not just the company on the block.
I love the inclusive way with which Javier spoke. He brought in something that each of us said. It was really wonderful. That's great leadership right there. Echoing back what your team has said. It's very smart, very smart. For my next question, I'm going to dig into some of the incredible questions that the audience has offered. I think some of them we may have already touched on, which is great because I don't want to leave too many on the table. But one, I think, would give us a good way to kind of level set across the different institutions that we represent some examples of success. One of our audience members, Gail, asks, what are the most significant DEI milestones that your organizations have achieved to date? Focus on the positive, please. How did you measure it? What are your next milestones you're working on? Basically, some examples where equity has successfully been implemented in companies and how you went about it, and how was it communicated to the entire organization. I think this is so important because so often we focus on what is wrong and we forget to celebrate and remind people that it is possible to change and transform. Racism can feel like this big, old, weighty thing that we haven't been able to fix so far, so we'll never fix it. So what's the point in trying, right? I should say, before I give it, hand it over to whomever wants to go first, I did say that my organization was 75% white and I was the only person of color on the executive team. When I left 4 years later, it was a majority person of color organization. The executive team was majority people of color, and we had doubled in size in terms of our revenue and our employees. Okay, so who wants to take this one first with some concrete examples of milestones achieved, measured, and communicated? Najma, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. I think there are a couple of things. As I talked about, Dell has always had a pretty inclusive culture. We've got a really wide known, understood people philosophy. And our people philosophy was simple, and it was ABC. And it was achieve, balance, and connect. But because of recent events and the acknowledgement by Michael and the senior leadership team, we wanted to really ensure that all of our team members understood what type of culture we wanted to be from an inclusion perspective. And so we added D to that. So now our people philosophy is embedded in A, B, C, and D, which is in diversity and inclusion, because we believe that the power of diversity is one that it's for us to lead by example. Like Deloitte, we put a framework in behind that around RISE. And the framework was introduced by Jeff Clark, our Chief Operating Officer, and Michael Dell for all of our senior leadership team members. What we've done is we've required all of our senior leaders to become familiar with this concept of representation, inclusion, sponsorship, and equity. Additionally, as a senior leader in the organization, is highly encouraged that we personally take part in any of efforts to ensure that our team members have the ability to achieve. So like China, I sit on our Black Network Alliance group for Dell Technologies, where I've got a group of individuals that I sponsor at the director level and above to ensure that and I follow their careers and I work with their leaders to make sure that they are achieving their objectives, and each of us have done so. The other things that we've done really specifically, we've done a lot in the area of awareness and education, is we've got a program around many advocating real change, where we really help people deal with the unconscious biases that they have and their abilities to think through those biases and how they continue to partner and to collaborate. But I think our biggest achievement really is in the fact that we have our Progress Made Real goals, our pre-2030 goals that were actually introduced by Michael in 2019 at an analyst meeting where we measured the success of our organization. We've been very public. And there was some question when we went out there with goals around specifically what we wanted to have from an inclusion perspective. 50% of our organization we want to have to be diverse female representation, 40% of those in leadership positions, and 15 to 25% of those in leadership positions represented by underrepresented minorities. I think those are very specific goals that we hold our senior leaders accountable for. Each of our ELT members have a plan to help to achieve those P2030 goals, and we're all deeply committed to that. So those are real specific measurables that as a senior executive, I am held accountable for. We believe at Dell, if you measure it, you're going to see it. So we inspect what we expect, and we've embedded that inspection in our processes and our systems.
Mm-hmm. All right. China, do you want to go next?
Sure, absolutely. So a couple of things, somewhat similar to some of the things that Najma has just mentioned, but we've done it a bit differently at Deloitte. And so insofar as we have taken an approach around our transparency report that is, I would argue or propose to you is fundamentally different. There are many organizations have transparency reports, but ultimately the question is, what are you actually reporting on? And so what we've taken an approach to say, there really is an opportunity here to look at metrics that have a real impact. And so we are unearthing what I would argue is more meaningful data from our perspective. And that really is to be able to say publicly, here are our growth rates. Here are what retention actually looks like. To understand not just growth and retention and acquisition, but to layer on sentiment data, to understand not just who's here, but how do they feel? And what are they saying is happening in the environment? And that third layer to look at well-being. And that transparency report, right? Because ultimately I can be at an organization, but if my well-being and my mental health aren't really being addressed by virtue of what's happening in the broader environment, either externally or internally, the reality is my productivity is different. So we've taken this triangulated approach around not just the traditional metrics, but to layer in both sentiment and well-being data. That's important because what we've also then done is taken the added step to say, and oh, by the way, that should be publicly available so that I, as a practitioner, or I, as a leader, can go in and look at this in a dynamic dashboard, and I have the ability to filter that data in a way that is useful to I'm trying to answer or understand about the organization. We've also then made that publicly available. So if you go to Deloitte.com, you actually can see our transparency report. You can understand our data. Because here's the thing, accountability is incredibly important. Transparent accountability that's more public creates a different level of responsibility, and also, quite frankly, a different level of pressure to continue to make progress, because it's not just held internally at the highest levels of the firm, it's also externally, more broadly, publicly. Now, that's how we've sort of communicated, if you will, evangelized what we're doing and the results and the outcomes. But the other component has been a really heightened focus, and this is, I think, incredibly important. This is, to the extent I have a soapbox, this is where China stands. And it is on this notion of empowerment of our people to drive their own careers and to give them the skills and the tools. Listen, everybody at Deloitte, we are a lot of smart human beings. Everybody's highly educated. Everybody is has expertise in their own right. But we all know that navigating an organization is about as many unwritten rules as there are the written rules. And so what we've done is we've launched, and we've been at this for a number of years. So the beauty is it is an evolution for us as well. A number of programs, particularly Springboard, that takes all of our, we have what we call senior managers. These are people who are headed into the partner or director level of the firm. And what we've said is, here is an opportunity for you to have a different kind of conversation, a different kind of learning. This isn't about functional knowledge and expertise. This is about the language of business, the cultural norm in which you operate, and how you can control and drive your own destiny. And once you've been ultimately educated on those things, you are then partnered and paired with a sponsor who has some responsibility, because sponsorship, unlike mentorship, and mentors and coaches are great, but sponsors are people who invest. They take their chits and extend them to you. They provide cover. And that is what really allows people to elevate to the next level. The result of that for us, last year, our partner group, we had more partners of color and a more diverse partnership class than we had in history. And so, and all of this was pre, right, George Floyd, pre Breonna Taylor. And the point here is that there are things that truly make a difference, and you can have a different set of outcomes, and that actually can occur, but it does require a commitment, right, that is ongoing.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So we have two very seasoned companies that I've followed and admired for a long time, Dell and Deloitte. Takeda is a 240-year-old new company because last year we merged with Shire. And in the midst of the social unrest happening, so we're taking advantage of that, the merger and the unfolding situation in the US to accelerate our diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. So for those of you who are in companies that are beginning that journey, I think our example would be great. Our accomplishments, I would call, are foundational. So we are really taking a hard look at what is the opportunity that we're trying to solve. We have created a diversity team. We have set up a diversity council for the company, both locally and globally. And more importantly, we have already set up a multi-year comprehensive strategy for the company that touches on everything from policy and access to medical, to workforce, to vendors and suppliers. And so we're really moving all these dials to have the maximum impact for the company. One of the things that I really touched me about what China said, that as part as we're setting all this up, we've also tried to shift this paradigm as we do it to do it together. The company is changing and putting a very strong commitment, resources and tools for change, but we're also inviting our employees to come along on that journey, because it's really, we have to change too. It's not just the systems at the companies. We are part of that system, and we have to be the change that we seek in the world. And so when those two things come together, the employees' commitment, their drive, the desire to see a more equitable, inclusive society, and the company's sustained investment, and when those two things meet, which is what's happening right now at Takeda, we're beginning to see real shifts. And I'll give you a taste of that. I was in a meeting on Tuesday, and the team had this big aha around clinical trials. And they said, for years, companies in our space expect the Black and brown communities to change so that they have access to medicine and participate in clinical trials. Maybe it's us who need to change. Maybe it's our approach who needs to be different, and stop trying to train the Black and brown communities and start to tell them what they need to do to take advantage of these programs. Maybe we need to reconsider how we are doing our approach. And so that's the kind of aha and insights that are beginning to happen at Takeda, and that we intend to carry through the future.
Great. Yeah, it's really, I think, helpful to hear from leaders at organizations that are at different levels and stages and phases in their journey, because I'm sure that with the 1.7 thousand people that we have on the call, there's all of that spectrum represented. I want to drill down into, with the moments we have left, some really concrete questions from our audience. One that I think is probably quite relevant to many people on the call says, it's very difficult to address racism directed at you while at work. You have to be professional, but at the same time, you want to let them know how upset you are. What are your best suggestions for really getting through to someone who's used casual racism against you? How can you get others to acknowledge what the other person did was unacceptable? How do we get people to acknowledge the disparities in our workplace without getting fired?
So Heather, if I might,
Yeah, please.
there are a couple of things. One of which is really about the broader cultural norm. And so we talk about brave spaces at Deloitte. This notion that you have the capacity and you are empowered to speak. That is incredibly important. You have to understand your broader environment. And so the reality is, if we're going to be really practical and tactical, you have to know where you are to understand what you can say. And so to the extent you are in a company environment where your leadership has continued to say that brave spaces or safe spaces, depending on one's terminology, that this notion that you are open to that kind of communication is licensed. And so where I come from, if you give me license, the notion of acting is up to me. And so understanding that first and foremost, because the reality is, if we're going to be truth tellers, not all environments are necessarily encouraging of that. So you do need to want to understand your environment. The second thing I would say, though, in terms of the moment where it occurs, where there is a microaggression or outright racist moment. Now, how you call a person on that circumstance or situation is a function of a couple of things. One is who you are as a person. So some of you have a high risk profile or risk takers and are willing to be far more direct, and others less so. It doesn't mean either of them are wrong or either one is more right than the other. It simply means engagement. And for me personally, is it's a function of, I say things to people like, so help me understand what you just said, because before I respond, I want to make sure my interpretation is clear. Did you mean A or did you mean B? Usually that's enough. That alone is enough. Sometimes, however, it isn't. And in that case, a conversation ensues. But I found, to put it simply, a well-placed question is sometimes far more powerful than a smart answer, because the question causes everyone else around that table to think, even if it wasn't them who was speaking.
May I build on that
Sure.
a little bit? So I think those are great tips, and I think, maybe I'll go to the place when that first approach you taking on your own doesn't really work. So in that case, I think, if that fails, I would suggest that you go at it with a posse, meaning find in your company people who you trust and you can talk about the situation with, maybe engage them in becoming part of the solution. And there always is in every organization. There are people who are going to be open and champions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, so that you don't have to face this alone. One of the most difficult things, I think, being in a situation where you are on the receiving end of discriminatory behavior or comments, is to feel that you have to face that alone. Many companies, Takeda included, and we've heard more from Dell and Deloitte, have employee resource groups. So that's a great place to find allies to strategize on how to address that problem. Obviously, the other great place is to have a conversation with a human resources partner that you trust, that can help you address this, from the point of view of employee relations and how to have that conversation. The key thing is that not to sweep it under the carpet, because organizations only grow when they have become comfortable with the uncomfortable, right? You have to have those uncomfortable conversations to stretch the organization, to stretch the leaders, to really foster that sense of inclusive leadership, and that we all have a responsibility to create a better environment for ourselves. So those would be additional ideas that I would offer.
Yeah, and if I could add, I would say from a leadership perspective, I think China, you hit from a cultural perspective and knowing your space, and also around personally where I'm comfortable. The other tips that I've seen work for myself and for others is I personify it. So I think people know you as an individual when you personify in a one-on-one setting, because I think it can be tricky to have that conversation in a public setting because of the emotion that could be associated with the discussion. But if I can pull that individual to the side in a one-on-one setting and have a conversation with them about how those comments made me feel, and then seeking to understand, as China said, making sure that I'm clearly understanding the intent and perhaps explaining my intent, then I found that it opens in dialogue and builds a bridge. And you also become this safe place for this individual who may not be aware of their comments or the way that their comments may have been viewed by the entire team. And I think as a leader, however, this is really specific for me as a leader, you need to go address that head on. Most organizations and cultures have an expectation of their leaders around the environments that they provide. For me, myself as a leader, when I find that I am in those situations, I deal with those quickly. And I do sometimes deal with those publicly and also privately with the individual. So it's not to create an uncomfortable situation, but I use it as a learning situation. And I take the time to reinforce the values. I take the time to reinforce what the expectations are for our organization. I think that it is extremely important as a leader for you to set the tone, and your actions in that situation will really determine how people feel this organization, how the organization feels about them as individuals. So I think that's pretty important to bring.
Great. Sadly, we only have a few minutes left. I did want to say that one principle that I think we remember often in performance outside of the DEI space, but we often forget when we go into the DEI space, is around feedback, and a rule of thumb being the 4-to-1 positive to constructive ratio. So often when we are when we want to focus on what needs to change in an organization, we forget to talk about what we don't want to change, right? What we think, what is working very well actually along these issues. And so, there were a lot of questions in the about sort of basically like, how do you tell your leadership that something is going wrong? Having been on both sides of that, I think remembering that oftentimes you only get the negative, and this is what we want to change, but remembering that everyone is there and there's something about the workplace that they love. There's something about the mission, the culture that they love. It has been a very stressful year, right? And we are all sort of, at our limit. And so finding ways one of the core values we had in our transformation was do it with joy as much as possible, like finding ways to really remember that what we're seeking is a place where everyone can be optimized and joyful. And so let's try to bring that along the way of the transformation. We have 1 minute left. I want to do just a quick lightning round, because I think probably some people will stay on, of just one last piece of insight that you want to share on all the topics that we've brought before we close. And then I will thank our 4 sponsors. And so let's start with Javier quickly. Just one last piece of insight that you want to share.
I think the last piece of insight is that while we want to see organizations that are more representative of the world that we live in, don't forget that fostering inclusive leadership and inclusive practices that address equity and inclusion is just as important. Those 2 things have to go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. Right. Excellent. China?
Sure. I would say the thing to remember is that regardless of where you are in the organization, whatever seat at whatever table you happen to be at, you have an opportunity virtually just because you are there. You have the opportunity to change the conversation. You have an opportunity to have any decision that's being discussed considered differently by virtue of being present. And so I don't want us to all look to what is leadership doing, because there is our own wingspan effect, as I call it. and the notion of what we can do where we are while we're there. If we're going to be present, then be engaged. And to the extent we are doing that, I think we create a weave that ultimately helps to move organizations forward, notwithstanding programs and policies and practices.
Yep. I think, Shannon, that's absolutely right. I think the other thing I want to say is, and you said it best, Heather, this has been a tough year. And so what I would encourage everyone else is think holistically about the entire, your entire self, your mental and your physical and your professional well-being, so that you can do what you need to do, and providing a culture that really ensures that we are taking care of the whole person and that we're holding ourselves accountable and you're giving yourself grace. I think we tend to put a lot of pressure on ourselves when you're put in these situations. Give yourself grace. We don't have to get it perfect all the time, but if you give yourself a little bit of grace, we will get it right more than we will get it wrong. And that's really what this is all about.
Beautifully said. Thank you. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I meant to do this at the outset, but I do want to acknowledge that, we are holding a lot of tragedy, the ongoing tragedy of the pandemic, with infection and death rates concentrated in Indigenous and Black and Brown communities, the stress that has been taken out on women at the workforce, so many women leaving the work world, because of the pandemic. And of course, most acutely, just in the past week, the mass shootings in Atlanta, which targeted the API community, and in Boulder just a few days ago. We are all holding a lot. This country has a lot of healing to do. So thank you for taking these steps with us. Thank you to our sponsors of this session, the Massachusetts and Texas Conferences for Women. Learn more about the Conferences for Women online and how you can get involved. The State Street to the Boston Globe. You'll receive an email soon with a link to today's session, and be on the lookout for the next session in the series coming in June. Thank you all to the panelists and the organizers, and thank you all to joining us today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.